Azure Rights Management. Hey everyone, Ben Finkel here, and in this nugget we are going to enable and administer Microsoft's Azure Rights Management, the information protection system that is included with Microsoft Office 365. We'll talk about how to activate and turn on Azure Rights Management. I'll show you briefly how you can use it from Microsoft Office, and then we'll get into some PowerShell commands that you can use to set up and enable administrators for Azure Rights Management. So imagine this nightmare scenario. An employee at your organization accidentally forwards an email full of sensitive financial information to a group on an email chain of people that are not supposed to have access to that information. They pop open that document and suddenly they get to read it all. Or maybe someone in HR prints off an Excel spreadsheet with a bunch of salaries on it and forgets about it and leaves it sitting at the printer for anyone who walks by to read. Or a disgruntled employee grabs a Word document, loads it up onto a thumb drive. It's got some corporate secrets on there, and he walks out the door, walks right into your competitor's office, and hands over that information to him. All of these scenarios are very real problems that organizations face today, and you may have run into them yourself or read about them online or even seen them happen at the place where you work. And it's a really big problem as we collect more and more private and sensitive data at the places we work, and we shuffle that data around. We need to send it around to different people in the organization. How do we ensure that it doesn't end up in the hands of people who aren't supposed to have it, even accidentally? Well, one part of the solution to that problem is something known as Azure Rights Management. And Azure Rights Management is simply a way to lock down or secure the Microsoft Word documents that you use inside, or rather the Microsoft Office documents that you use inside of your organization. With Azure Rights Management, you can encrypt these documents when you create them, and then you can hook them up to your Microsoft Office 365 account, and you can define which users or which groups of users are allowed to read them or edit them or even print them. You have really fine-grained control over the access to these documents with Azure Rights Management. For this nugget, I want to show you how you can get set up and get started using ARM, as it's called, and administering it from the Office 365 environment. Now, you kind of know what you're thinking. I'm bouncing a little bit back and forth here. It's Office 365, but also Azure. What's the connection there? Well, Office 365 uses Microsoft Azure Active Directory as the supporting technology behind it, specifically for the users and groups that you create in Office 365. So if you're using Office 365, you're using Azure Active Directory, even if you don't know it, and by extension, you have access to Azure Rights Management. In order to get it set up and get it working here inside of your organization, you're going to need to first activate Rights Management inside of the admin console. It's really easy to do. And then you need to integrate it with Microsoft Office. Basically, the clients, the people who want to protect documents, will have to connect to the ARM server from their Microsoft Office installation. And then finally, we need to manage the Azure RM roles, the two administrator roles for Azure Rights Management, and these are going to be done via PowerShell. Let's talk briefly about the ARM PowerShell commandlets that you need to know for both administering ARM on a day-to-day basis as well as passing the 70-346 exam. And then I'll jump into my demo system and I'll actually set all this up live. There are two types of administrators for Azure Rights Management that you need to know about, and they are the Basic Administrator and the ARM Super User. The Azure Rights Management Administrator, the Basic Administrator, can administer the Azure Rights Management system, but importantly, they do not have access, unless they've been explicitly granted access by the document owner, to the data inside a protected or a secured document. So they administer ARM without having access to the information or the data. And this is really great, right? You're going to need people to administer ARM who don't necessarily require access to see HR data or financial data or whatever it is you're storing inside of your documents. It's really easy to add someone as an ARM administrator role. You're going to call the PowerShell command add AADRM role-based administrator. And there's two different ways that you can do this. The first way is to pass in the email address of the user from Office 365 that you're adding into this role. This will grant that user access to this role. Now, the second way to do it is to use something known as the Object ID out of Azure Active Directory or Office 365. And the Object ID is a unique identifier. It's basically a big random string of letters and numbers that identifies a specific individual identity inside of Office 365, inside of Azure Active Directory. And you're asking yourself, well, why use that? There's email address right there. Why would I want to use the Object ID? The reason you want to use the Object ID is because Object ID can be used to refer to security groups. We cover security groups in another nugget. But by granting this administrator role to a security group, you have a much easier way to manage who does and does not have access to ARM, because you can simply add and remove users to that security group from the Office 365 portal interface. So I will show you when we drop down to the command line how you can use both email address or how you can get the object ID of a security group and use that to update or add an administrator role. The full documentation for this command can be found right here at this URL. Go ahead and check it out. You can be asked various different things about the command on the exam, although the email address and the object ID are the two parameters that you really need to know. The superuser feature is even simpler and easier to use because you cannot add superuser to a group using object ID. You can only add it by email address. So it's a very simple command: add AADRM superuser and pass in the email address. However, before you can do that, you have to enable the feature. Because superusers are both ARM administrators and they have full access to any documents protected by ARM, it's disabled by default. It represents a pretty glaring security flaw, and really you only want to use it temporarily when it's absolutely necessary. So enable it, add a user to it. When you're done, you remove the user and disable the feature. But by default it's disabled. You have to call the enable superuser feature before you can use this particular feature and add a user to the role. You can read, again, all about this command right here at this URL. Now, as far as ARM goes, some things that you won't necessarily be asked about in the exam, but other commands that you might want to know about. You can add role-based administrators. You can get those administrators. You can remove them, of course. You need to be able to remove people from the role. And unsurprisingly, you can do the same thing with the superuser command. So add, get, and remove will add, get, and remove superusers from the superuser feature. All of these commands, plus all of the other Azure Rights Management commands, are found here at this URL. This is a piece of documentation you simply want to bookmark and keep on hand for reference whenever you're working with ARM via PowerShell. Now, what do you say we get our click on and take a look at this live inside of the demo system? The first step, if you recall all the way back to the beginning of this nugget, was we had to launch our admin portal inside of Office 365 and enable Azure Rights Management. Now, if you've looked up how to do this online, the documentation has changed a little bit recently as the portal has been restructured. But the ARM activation is found under Settings, Services, and Add-ins. When you select this panel, you're able to find your Azure Rights Management, although it's not called Azure Rights Management, it's called Azure Information Protection. Why do they do this? I have no idea. Select that, and I'm going to go to the link here that says to manage it. So this is going to jump me into a slightly different page. This is part of the Microsoft Azure interface, and I will simply click the Activate button. That's all I need to do to activate Azure Rights Management. Now, if you're not using Enterprise E3, you may incur a charge to enable Rights Management. I want you to keep that in mind. The subscription that I've chosen, Enterprise E3, has ARM included in the cost. You may have to pay extra to enable this if you've chosen a cheaper subscription. Now, to see this in action, I've got a Microsoft Word document open up here, and this is Microsoft Word 2016, in which Azure Rights Management is natively supported, so that's pretty sweet. First of all, notice up here in the upper right, Superuser CBTN. I am signed into this particular installation of my Word document with the same user that I signed into the portal as, so I have access to the Office 365 subscription that we're working with. And if I have sensitive data in here that I don't want anyone to change, check out what happens when I come over here to the Review tab. There is a Protect option. I can simply say Restrict Editing. So what do I want to do? Well, I want to limit and pretend to anyone from editing this document. You know what? There should be some exceptions. Who are the exceptions? Who can edit this document? I click this More Users button down here, and let's say Ben Finkel at cbtoffice.com. That is a user in my Office 365 subscription. You know what? It found it. There's Ben Finkel at cbtoffice.com. Scroll down at the bottom here. It's a little bit tough to see, but start enforcing protection. And now this document will not be allowed to be edited. And I can either give it a password to unlock it or user authentication. So only this user, as the owner of the document, can remove the protection. So now the editing is restricted on this to only the users that were listed. As I try to type in here, it's telling me at the bottom, you can't make this change because the selection is locked. So pretty sweet. Easy to hook up to ARM and prevent only specific users from editing your document. Now finally, I want to show you how you can use PowerShell to set up administrators for ARM inside of Office 365. I'm going to bring up my Windows PowerShell IDE here, my command line for Windows PowerShell. And the first thing that you'll need to know is that I followed along with my PowerShell for Office 365 in Azure Nugget to install the various tools that I need to connect PowerShell to my my Office 365 account. If you haven't done that, if you don't know what I'm talking about, go watch that nugget first and perform those steps before you can do this. The next thing you need to do is you need to import a module, specifically the AADRM module. And if the AADRM module is not found on your system, you may need to launch this page here and install the AADRM tools locally on your system. They're going to be found on Windows Server systems without a problem. If you're on a Windows desktop like 8.1 or 10, you're going to need to go and install this software package. Once I've imported that module, I also need to connect to my MS Online service account, which is how I connect to my Office 365 subscription in PowerShell. Again, this is all covered in that nugget. Once I'm connected to the Office service, I also need to connect to the AADRM service if I'm going to work with AADRM PowerShell commandlets. I'll run this command, and it's going to need another account that it knows is already an administrator. Now I can use my existing global administrator account because as the global administrator, I'm already an administrator of Azure ARM. From here, I'm ready to call some Azure Rights Management PowerShell. I can add a role-based administrator using the -email switch, and I can make Ben Finkel at cbtoffice.com an Azure Rights Management role-based administrator. Simply run that command, boom, it's done. It's that easy to do. If I want to remove it, I could simply do the remove-AADRM role-based administrator. But we also talked about using the object ID in order to set up a group as the administrator so that we can add and remove users from a group, thus granting them administrator access. We use the MS Online service commandlets to get a group, so I'm going to call get MSOL group right here. And you can see I get back, one group I already have inside of my service, ADRM admins. Guess what? That sounds like a good idea to use for my rights management admins. And check it out here, this random string, this object ID. This is the one that I actually want to pass into that command. So I'm going to copy that onto the clipboard. And I will paste it in as the object ID parameter. Again, it's that easy. Once I've done that, I can add this, this group as an admin for rights management. You could, of course, pull that object ID down into a variable. That's probably what you want to do, and pass that variable in as the object ID parameter, but you get the idea. Same thing goes with the super user feature. Once I'm here, I can paste in enable-AADRM super user feature, execute that, and now the super user feature is enabled. And if I wish to add a super user, I'm going to call add-AADRM super user, the email address switch, Ben Finkel at cbtoffice.com is now a super user for Azure Rights Management, which again means that I'm not only an ARM administrator, but I can also unlock and unprotect and view any protected documents that use ARM. So that concludes this nugget on administering Azure Rights Management for Office 365. Just to recap, it's easy to hook up Azure Rights Management. All you need to do is log into the portal, the admin interface at portal.office.com. Navigate through the admin interface to activate Azure Rights Management. Then you can connect your Office clients to ARM in order to protect them, and you can set up your users, your administrators, and your super user administrators via PowerShell with the correct PowerShell commands. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.